The wind howled across the empty plains like a lost soul, dragging dust across the dry grasslands in sweeping, mournful gusts. The sky overhead was a low ceiling of gray, heavy with the promise of an early winter. On a ridge, silhouetted against the pale light, sat a lone rider, broad-shouldered, weather-worn, and still as the grave. John Callahan hadn't spoken to another soul in 8 days. Not since the mule kicked loose a wagon wheel and he cursed it, more out of habit than hope. His ranch lay 30 miles east, tucked in a basin where the sun barely rose over the hills in winter. It was his kingdom and his prison. There was land, enough to raise cattle, but not enough to bury the silence. He rode into the trading post at Sundown Junction without expectation. He needed salt, kerosene, and nails. What he didn't expect, what stopped him cold, was the girl. She stood barefoot, in the mud, arms wrapped around a swollen belly, no more than 18. Long, tangled hair matted to her cheek, eyes dull with fear but not broken. A woman behind her, tobacco-stained teeth, a cracked voice, shouted something about a fair price. A few men leered, one of them laughing, when she slapped the girl's shoulder and said, "Useless but still breathin', make me an offer." John froze. His hand dropped instinctively toward his belt, but the men weren't armed. Not really. Just drunk, cruel, and numb to decency. He dismounted slowly. The girl turned to him then, just for a second. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She just looked at him like someone who had already lost everything except the right to stand. It was 1872, Montana Territory. The war had ended years ago, but men like John still fought ghosts. His wife, Sarah, had died in childbirth back in Texas, left him with a name for a daughter who never breathed. That night, he'd held her hand and prayed to a God that never answered. Since then, he had only asked for one thing: silence. And now, here was this girl, young, scared, pregnant. He asked her name. She didn't speak. Her mother snarled, "Ava, May, don't know who knocked her up, ain't my problem." John turned away. He had no business in this. He didn't need more burdens, but as he walked toward the store, he heard the girl's mother call out, "I'll take 2 colts for her. That's more than she's worth. Throw in some flour and I'll call it square." The wind picked up again. Dust in his eyes. A memory. Sarah's last breath. Blood on his hands. The midwife's whisper, "There's nothing more we can do." He turned back, hands shaking. 2 colts, he said quietly, and a sack of flour. He didn't wait for her reply. He dropped the reins and walked into the store. When he came out, the mother was gone. The girl remained. She stood exactly where she had, arms crossed, watching him. Still no words. Just that same, unblinking stare. He mounted his horse and rode east without a word. 10 minutes later, he heard footsteps behind him. Eva May walked behind him for miles before he stopped. When he offered her the back of the mule, she climbed on without thanks. They traveled in silence, the wilderness stretching before them like a promise and a curse. For 3 days, they didn't speak. She slept on the far side of the fire, barely ate. He built a lean-to from pine branches, checked the traps, and hunted rabbit. He never asked about the child. He didn't want to know, but every so often he'd catch her watching him from across the flames, and the look wasn't anger or fear. It was curiosity. On the 4th morning, she sat beside him by the fire and took the coffee from his hand without asking. That night they heard the wolves. The wind had turned sharp, carrying the scent of snow. The first flakes came soft like ash. John had boarded the windows of the cabin earlier that fall, but now the wind screamed around the walls like it was alive. The fire sputtered. Outside, something moved. Low growls in the distance, then the unmistakable sound of claws against frozen earth. Eva's eyes widened. She stepped closer to the hearth. John grabbed the rifle and moved toward the door. "Stay here." She didn't. Together they stepped out into the storm. Snow blinded them. The wolves circled the barn. One lunged from the shadows. John fired. Blood sprayed across the white. Another howl. Closer now. Eva grabbed an axe from the wall and dragged kindling to the doorway, shivering violently. She couldn't lift the rifle, but she could stack wood. She could keep the fire alive. They worked side by side without words. After the last wolf fled, John collapsed onto the bench, soaked and trembling. His shoulder bled from a scratch. Eva knelt beside him, hands red with cold. "You saved me once," she whispered. "I won't let you freeze alone." He didn't answer, just closed his eyes. That night she stayed by the fire, closer than before. Neither of them slept. In the morning, the world was white. The wolves were gone. Trust out here was never given with words. It was carved in firewood, measured in bullets, sealed with silence. And for the first time in years, John felt the ache of something he had buried long ago, a reason to keep living. The wind had calmed, but in its place came something colder, stillness. For weeks the snow had piled high around the ranch, muting every sound, every footfall. Then one afternoon, just as the light began to die, the silence broke. Horses, 3 of them. Riders in worn dusters and hats pulled low, eyes hidden beneath brims stained with road and blood. John stepped out onto the porch with his rifle hanging low but ready. Eva stood behind the curtain, breath held. The riders claimed to be traders, moving west from Cheyenne, said they were looking for shelter and a hot meal. Something in the way they smiled made John's gut twist. The tallest dismounted and stared too long at Eva's silhouette behind the window. "Thought you looked familiar," he said with a sneer. "Ain't she the one ran off from Dawson's farm?" Another muttered something under his breath. The first man chuckled. "That one's mine. Least, she was for a night or two." John's jaw locked. "There's food and a fire," he said flatly. "But you leave at dawn. No liquor, no noise. You stay respectful, or you leave now." The bandits agreed, but their eyes told a different story. That night John sat at the table, rifle within reach. Eva cleaned quietly by the hearth, her eyes darting to the door. The men laughed too loudly. One tapped the barrel of his pistol with a finger, like a man itching to see it used. When the fire burned low, John stood and said, "You sleep in the barn." A pause. One man rose. "I think we'll stay inside." John didn't flinch. "You won't." A long silence followed. Then movement outside, shadows along the back wall. John's instincts screamed. He leaned in close to Eva. "Root cellar now." She hesitated. "You'll be outnumbered." "Won't be the first time." He moved to the window, rifle raised. A shot rang out from the dark. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. John returned fire. One man fell screaming. Another tried to climb through the door. John caught him in the chest. Blood hit the snow like ink on parchment, but not fast enough. A third shot slammed into John's side. He dropped hard, face down in blood and ash. The world blurred. He heard shouting, Eva's scream. Then, nothing. Somewhere, far off, footsteps approached. The cold stung his skin when he opened his eyes again. Not firelight, sunlight filtered through pine boughs. A fire crackled beside him. A shape moved in and out of focus. Lean, quiet, face painted in war ash, a necklace of bone and obsidian, white elk. John tried to sit up, failed. "You always were too stubborn to die," White Elk said, his voice like dry bark. "Still true, I see." They had served together in Tennessee, 2 outcasts in a brotherhood of dying men. White Elk had pulled him from a trench once, dragging him a mile through blood and swamp. Now he'd done it again. John groaned. "Eva?" "She's safe. Watched over you all night." Later, when Eva crept into the hut, she froze at the sight of the stranger. White Elk did not rise or speak, just nodded. She didn't trust him, not yet. But she saw the way he bandaged John's wounds with steady hands and gentleness. She watched him leave meat by the fire without asking for thanks. "Why help us?" she asked. He only said, "Some debts live longer than the men who owe them." Days passed. John healed slowly. The deep cut across his ribs turned purple and ugly, but he endured. Eva tended to him, eyes sharper now, hands steady. She sat longer by his side. Her belly had grown, heavy and proud. White Elk stayed, not as a guest, but as a shadow. He showed Eva how to set snares in the woods, how to spot tracks in snow. She learned to listen for storms, to feel the wind shift in her bones. One evening, Eva sat beside the fire, her hands cradling her stomach. "I thought this baby would ruin me," she said, her voice soft. "But maybe it's the one thing I did right." John listened, didn't speak, just added wood to the fire. Later, when she had gone to bed, he sat with White Elk, staring into the flames. "She's strong," John said. "Braver than I ever was." White Elk nodded. "She has purpose now, do you?" John didn't answer. Instead, the next day, he started carving wood. By the end of the week, it began to take shape. A cradle. Smooth curves, joints tight, no nails, just hands, hope, and time. Eva watched him quietly. She didn't interrupt. That night, John sat on the porch, alone. Snow fell softly. He clutched something small, a button from his wife's dress. He'd kept it in his coat pocket for years. He walked past the barn, beyond the fence, to the hill where two crude wooden crosses stood. He knelt beside them. Sarah, and the daughter they'd never known. "I tried," he whispered. "I tried to make it mean something. But I failed you. I left you alone." His voice cracked. "You should have lived. Not me." He punched the earth. Blood from his knuckles mixed with the snow. Behind him, a shape moved. He didn't turn. Eva stood with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't come closer. Just looked at the grave. Then at him. "We all carry ghosts," she said quietly. "Yours don't scare me." He looked up, and for the first time in years, he wept without shame. Not for Sarah, not even for the child, but for the man he used to be, and the one he might still become. The wind picked up again, this time with a bite that foretold more than snow. It came with an eerie stillness, a calm too fragile to last. Clouds gathered fast and low, wrapping the plains in lead. Then came the unmistakable crunch of hooves on frozen earth. They returned, more of them now. 6, maybe 7 riders, rifles strapped across their backs, eyes shadowed by wrath. The one who had claimed Eva as his own led the pack, his face freshly scarred, a sling wrapped around his arm from the last encounter. John spotted them from the barn and said nothing. He just turned, strode to the house, and began loading shells. White Elk appeared silently beside him, nodded once, and melted into the tree line with his long rifle. The cabin darkened. Inside, Eva clutched her side, breath ragged. "They're coming," John said, voice low. She nodded once, sweat already beading her forehead. "The pain started this morning," she whispered. "It's close." He felt the world pull tight around him. "Stay here. Don't move." Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and slow. It painted the men as they dismounted, silent, focused. White Elk fired first. One dropped with a howl. Chaos broke. John stood in the doorway, rifle braced. Fire burst from the barrel. One bandit fell into the snow, limbs twitching. Another circled behind the barn. White Elk picked him off before he reached the side window. Gunfire snapped through the air like lightning. Inside the cabin, Eva screamed. John fired again, took a shot to the leg, stumbled. He dragged himself to the door, slammed it shut just as another bandit rushed it. A boot shattered the lower panel. John fired through the smoke. The man fell backward, dead before he hit the snow. Eva's cries turned sharp. Urgent. The baby was coming. John turned toward her, torn. Blood soaked his pant leg, but he limped to her side. And then, crash. Another body crashed through the back window. A man, face smeared in soot and frost, stumbled toward Ava, knife in hand. John couldn't reach his rifle in time. A shot rang out. The attacker froze, dropped to his knees, blood bubbled from his mouth. White Elk stood behind him, rifle still smoking. Then silence. Only Eva's breathing filled the room. Fast, desperate, strained. Hours passed like slow thunder. Candles flickered. The cabin smelled of blood, smoke, and gunpowder. Outside, snow buried the dead. Eva screamed again and again. John knelt at her side, his hands trembling. She gripped his wrist. "Don't let me die," she whispered. "You won't," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was promising her or begging God. Lightning cracked in the distance. The wind howled like a demon. And then silence. A wet cry, then another. John held his breath. The baby lay still. Then, a gasp, a hiccup, a small, raw cry that tore through the room and filled it with something neither of them had heard in years. Hope. John looked down. A girl. Ava sobbed and laughed in the same breath. "She's alive." John wrapped the child in his coat, bloodied and threadbare but warm. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the wounds, not the ghosts, not the war outside or within. Just that one sound, that impossible, beautiful cry. Days passed. The sun returned, glinting off snow-covered plains, like diamonds over a grave. John stood on the porch, the baby in his arms. He looked down at her, her face soft, pink, fragile. She blinked at the world like she was challenging it to try again. Inside, Eva slept, pale but alive. Her hair was damp with sweat, her chest rising and falling slowly. White Elk sat beside the fire, carving a tiny rattle from cedar wood. His hands worked silently, reverently. John stared at the cradle now finished. His rough hands had sanded it smooth. A place for her, this new life, this second chance. "She wasn't mine," he whispered, "but I'll protect her like she was." White Elk rose later without a word. He walked to the cradle, placed the carved rattle inside, and beside it, a single white feather. He turned to leave. "Will you stay?" John asked. White Elk shook his head. "You need roots. I am wind." And with that, he disappeared into the trees, his footprints swallowed by snow before nightfall. The next morning, John walked the baby out to the hill where 2 wooden crosses stood. He knelt, not in sorrow, but in peace. "I'm not forgetting," he said softly, "but I'm letting go." He buried a small token there, a piece of Sarah's dress wrapped in cloth. Then he looked down at the child. "Your name is Hope," he said, "because that's what you gave us." The sky was clear. For the first time in years, the air felt alive. John stood on the porch again that evening, Ava beside him, the baby asleep in her arms. The plains stretched out, endless and still, dangerous, but something had shifted. Not peace, not yet, but purpose, a reason to wake, to fight, to live. The wind whispered past them, softer now. 3 souls, scarred and stitched together by loss, had survived, and in the ashes of everything they had once been, something new had taken root.